Welcome back to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're thrilled to have Evert. I'm not even going to try on his last name because I'm famous for butchering them, but he's with us today, and he's a professor of military history at Stellenbosch University and the Faculty of Military Science. Evert, it's great to have you with us today, and to get started, could you share a bit about your background and what led you to military history?
Thank you, Max and Tony. It's good to chat to you today. So, yes, I work at the Department of Military History at the Faculty of Military Science of Stellenbosch University, and I was a typical military brat. I think that obviously had an influence on me probably going down the path of military history, but I've got very fond memories of my father telling me stories about the Voortrekkers fighting the Matabeles and the Zulus and the English and the, whatever in South African history that we sort of grew up with. My mom is also a teacher. So I think, like my father with his professional military career, my mother's teaching background sort of combined and pushed me to the direction of joining the Defence Force. I was very fortunate to be able to study at the military academy and get a tuition at the taxpayer's expense, which is always a bonus. I think the first time I paid for my own degree was at my PhD level. And then, worked hard, and Tony was in the mix as well, in my background, and we both slogged it out. And I was very fortunate to be afforded the opportunity to come work as a lecturer. And I've been here since 2019, and just taken every opportunity to try and publish and research and write and try and contribute something meaningful to South African military historiography.
Evert, thanks so much. And you putting that you're trying to publish, but we know that you've done a lot of good work, and we'll be adding some of your books into the show notes. And as you mentioned, Evert and I know each other since our time in the SANDF, and that's been a while. But could you tell us and our listeners a little bit about the Ossewabrandwag and how they fit into your book, Hitler's South African Spies?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So I think just to start with South Africa, by the time the Second World War broke out, South Africa was a divided society, and it was basically polarized between the South Africans that supported the Smuts and his United Party, or the South African Party, that wanted to fight with the British Commonwealth in the Second World War. And on the other hand, you had the National Party, mainly conservative Afrikaners, that were against a war with Germany and that wanted to sort of fall back on those old loyalties that the former Boer republics had with the Germans. So the Ossewabrandwag was basically a cultural movement, probably could put it in inverted commas, a cultural movement, but it was created on the centenary commemoration of the Great Trek, where that commemorated the movement of the Afrikaans community out of the Cape Colony under the British yoke that moved into the interior of South Africa. So by 1938, they had really galvanized the mood of the nation, the spirit of the Afrikaner around the centenary celebration. And this soon became a vehicle for opposition to South Africa's war effort after September 1939. So there are many diverging works on the Ossewabrandwag, and some people will argue that it was mainly a cultural movement. And I do think that's true for the most part, but there was a definite activistic, militant segment to the Ossewabrandwag as well that actively undermined the Union's war effort, that sought to establish links with Nazi Germany, and that actively aided German agents in South Africa during the Second World War to collect intelligence and transmit it back to Germany. So you've got two very different pictures of the Ossewabrandwag. And I was particularly interested in them. Well, my interest was sparked. There was a book that I read that my dad had on his bookshelf. It was called The OB, Traitors or Patriots. Well, it had a question mark at the end of it. And I read this book probably about 20 odd years ago, and it alluded to some of these connections that the Ossewabrandwag had with the German intelligence networks, but it didn't go into too much detail. And by the time I got around to my PhD studies, a part of my work focused on naval intelligence in the Second World War. And then the Ossewabrandwag sort of crept back into it. Once I started digging deeper into the German agents, I realized that the Ossewabrandwag was actually a key nodal point for them in the war, and they wouldn't be able to do their jobs without the Ossewabrandwag supporting them in South Africa.
Nice. I mean, it's always like this for me when Tony brings interesting guests, especially from South Africa, because in our part of the world, or I'm from Sweden and in Europe, and in the northern hemisphere, we usually focused on, of course, we don't hear a lot. I mean, for South Africa for us is apartheid, and the last episode we recorded was about South African POWs. So it's always a very interesting dynamic for me. But when we're talking about these South African spy stories, and how did you come to do this research? Where do you find sources for this? Where do you start? Because I wouldn't have any idea where to even begin. In Europe, yes. Even in the United States, yes. Even in China, yes. But in South Africa, how did you uncover these stories?
No, that's a good question, Max. So yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to the PhD, and that sort of got me increasingly down the rabbit hole further and further. The PhD dealt with the bigger naval war in South African waters in the Second World War. So from a strategic point of view, coastal defenses, the Nazi U-boat operations in South African waters. And then the next logical step was sort of to look at naval intelligence. How were the Germans able to send U-boats so far down the coast to Southern Africa or South Africa to launch limited submarine campaigns here? And were they acting on some sort of intelligence? That was sort of what I was trying to figure out. And then I started scratching deeper and deeper, and by that stage I had resigned from the SANDF. Typical military story. Your academic career, my academic trajectory went upwards, and my sort of military career went spiraling downwards because I wasn't doing any more promotional courses. Anyway, I got a job at Northwest University in Potchefstroom, South Africa, and part of my responsibility was the Ossewabrandwag archive. So I had literally 10 meters away from my office, I had the whole archival collection of this organization. And included in that was two of the major German agents. Their personal recollections and some of their personal papers were located there. And then I was able to triangulate it with a lot of archival material from the National Archives of the United Kingdom. So MI5, the British Security Service, they were prolific in the amount of documentary evidence that they collected throughout the war on anybody that they would find probably suspicious or that would arouse suspicion. So they had a file on the leader of the Ossewabrandwag. They had files on the Ossewabrandwag as an organization, and then they had files on the German intelligence organization in what is today Mozambique, then Portuguese East Africa. And that detailed the whole story. So by triangulating the sources in the UK with the sources in South Africa, I was able to get quite a unique picture on what was happening. And the great thing was, just to get back to the Ossewabrandwag archive, in the 70s and the 80s, the archivist actually went and he interviewed these old German agents. So you have them, you physically can hear their voices when they're being asked questions. It was not a professional setup like your podcast, but you could hear the guy's parrot in the background and his wife bringing cups of coffee, and it like shakes and it's put down on the table. But nevertheless, you hear like a first person account of what they were doing and what the intention was.
Wow, that is unique. That is a pretty unique level of detail. Love that.
And on that, Evert, so you did all that kind of stuff. It kind of built on your first book to do with the submarines, right? Or the naval warfare.
Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, as with any academic study, there's you sit with a lot of information, but some of it's not maybe meant for the dissertation. So I quickly realized when I was doing the study that there was a bigger story to tell, and that this spies intelligence, that was going to be, I could be able to sell that to a publisher and they would probably take it. So after I completed the PhD, I bombarded the publicist at Jonathan Ball with a few ideas. And I mean, some of them were shot down. I think that's quite important to note as well. Not every idea that I've ever had was labeled as good or worthy of publication. But fortunately, with this Hitler Spies, they showed interest. And I mean, it coincided with sort of my arrival at the military academy, but then also COVID. So I had a bit of time to extra time almost, so to say, to work on it, and it also dovetails quite nicely with an academic book that I got out on the naval war in South African waters. So for me, the synergy between the naval history and the intelligence history was there, and that allowed me to have two good publications that talks to one another.
Very well done. No, it really is impressive. I want to go back just a little bit to what you had mentioned earlier. So Jan Smuts comes back during the Second World War, Prime Minister for the second time, I believe. Also a general and advisor to Winston Churchill. Just some thoughts on what was Smuts' view of what was happening in South Africa at the time. Did he keep a close eye?
It's a very good question. I'll give my opinion because I don't exactly know what Smuts was thinking. I don't know if anybody ever knows exactly what he was thinking. But I think Smuts, they were definitely aware of what was happening. They were aware of course, the Ossewabrandwag, but they were also very aware of the German agents in South Africa. My hypothesis is that it was sort of like a tolerable nuisance, so they would be able to tolerate it because they figured out, I think, very quickly that this organization or the spies, the intelligence that they were collecting and passing on, were not as strategic in nature that it would really affect the war effort, especially by the time that they started direct two-way communications between South Africa and Germany. The tide of the war had turned drastically. I mean, the submarine campaigns in the waters off South Africa was all but over. Germans had been kicked out of North Africa. So, yeah, I think they knew that there was not much worth in it. I think it had some propaganda worth maybe, or political worth, but I think they were willing to tolerate what was happening. Yeah, that's sort of my take on it.
I'm not going to talk about Smuts and his colleague, which I'm not going to try to pronounce again because I made that mistake in another episode. But it's a lot of logistics when I think about this. When you have even when you have a submarine, operations down in South Africa, I mean, it's massive logistics involved in this, and I think that is something we need to uncover in a different episode. I want to loop back a bit to the book. I have some specific questions in chapter 11, the counterinsurgency war. Can you tell us a bit more about that, because it's hit something with me?
Yeah, so the counterintelligence aspect, I think, of this whole story is really, I agree with you. That was the most exciting bit of the work to do. So I think the intelligence aspect is interesting, but the counterintelligence is sort of where it really comes together. So what struck me was always that the South Africans couldn't do this by themselves. They needed the help of the British in many different ways. I mean, we've already mentioned MI5 and their ability to good record keeping and keeping their fingers on the tabs of what was happening. But through the Royal Navy and their WWII organization that was responsible for signals intelligence, the British, along with the South Africans, were able to intercept all of the illicit transmissions in South Africa. Initially only intercept and copy, not reading it, but then later on sending it to GCHQ and at Bletchley Park or GC and CS, the Government Code and Cipher School, where they then started deciphering these messages and reading it retrospectively, and then being able to build up these dossiers. So from about 1942, the South Africans and the British are in the loop exactly what is happening and what sort of messages are being passed along. And they're also able to pick up the German codes and when they are trying to change the German code. So they are able, they're fully in the loop of what is happening. What I think is really interesting is like in Europe after the war, or even just before the end of the war, there was a determined drive to start prosecuting war criminals, people that were probably guilty of treason during the war, wartime treason, for helping out the enemy forces or aiding the Nazi war effort in many different ways. And in South Africa, the same happens. There's a determined move by the government under Smuts to try and find out what was the extent of the treason committed during the war. And they dispatched two different missions to Europe to firstly try and collect all available intelligence from the Brits and also in post-war Germany, and then to start interviewing anybody that had a tangible link to the Ossewabrandwag and their links to these German intelligence organizations. So it was called the Rhine and the Barrett missions, and they did really excellent work. And we are very fortunate that their administrative files or the correspondence files survived. It took a long time for me to find them and locate them, but I did eventually in the South African National Archive. So that allowed me to correlate, sort of like the primary sources from the British archives with what the South Africans were doing after the war. And it was like a happy marriage. Or, well, not an unhappy one, but a happy one. They spoke to one another, and it showed that what the British had been collecting during the war and the South Africans had all triangulated, and it all made sense. So they were able to build up a big dossier of high treason against the leader of the Ossewabrandwag and his associates that had been helping the German war effort.
That's very interesting, and that chapter really was interesting on the counterintelligence stuff. And I just wanted to mention, before I come on to the next question, Evert, that I do agree with you about your position on Smuts, and that he saw it as kind of a mild irritation. And this seems to be a lot of his experience in the early 20th century was, he knows the country's divided. He knows better than anyone.
Yeah. But
with his high-minded approach, let's get to the next thing. And he's always on that international scene. But enough about Smuts for now. Because we mentioned POWs, and I'm not sure how much you can share about your next book, if anything, or a teaser at least.
So before I'm also a man of many different PhD topics. Some of them that were finalized, well, at least one, and others that were sort of left behind. But one of them that I've decided now to take further was to focus on the South African escapers and invaders in the Second World War. One of your previous guests, Dr. Karen Horn, who wrote on the Italian POWs recently, the Italian POWs in South Africa, she's done very good work on South African prisoners of war in general during the Second World War. But one of the areas that she didn't really focus attention on was those that escaped and evaded. So I've got a book contract. So now I need to deliver. So I'm in the process of collecting a lot of primary archival material. And what I do have, and I have already collected with the help of researchers in the UK, is quite unique new insights on those that escaped and evaded. So I think I'm going to be able to at least have a sample of about, I think there's something like 800 plus South Africans that escaped and evaded, and most of them, if they made it to the Allied lines, were then debriefed. And I've got my hands on most of those debriefs. So yeah, it's a lot of data to work through, but I think it's got the promise of making for some interesting work in the next 2 years.
I must agree with you. There's so much attention on MI9 and so sort of the escape routes, through France, through other parts of Europe during the time. And definitely there's a gap in the historiography for us, or for South Africa at least, on that.
Yeah. So, I think that's the one bit of our POW history that needs to be written. Like you say, I think the focus, it's popular. If you go into a bookshop, probably in Europe or even in South Africa, you'll find books on escape and evasion and MI9, and you'll even sometimes find personal accounts of South Africans that escaped and evaded. And there are, of course, many different routes that they had. There are those that escaped immediately in North Africa, and then there are those that escaped before the Italian armistice in 1943 in Italy, which is, of course, was a different ball game to those that escaped maybe after the Germans then came and occupied Italy as well. And then there are those South Africans that moved to Germany and that tried to escape from there. So, I think all in all, very unique, diverse experiences. And of course, sometimes I do think we forget the South African soldiers from the colored, the Indian and the black cultural groupings that also escaped and also evaded and were successful. And you can imagine how difficult that must have been in wartime Europe to achieve that. So I think hopefully I'm able to shed some more light on that as well.
I'm looking forward to that. And when we're talking about books, do you have any recommendations if you want to level up your South African spy game or military history in general that you would recommend?
So I think, look, there are some other accounts out there. The one I mentioned before, the book It's called OB Traitors or Patriots. It's probably one of the most important ones to start with. I can't really remember the author's surname. If you give me a moment. George Visser. He's a good one to start with. It's an old book, I think published in 1976. But then of late, if you want to read some of the more popular stuff, the work of a South African author named Albert Blake. He's done some work on both the Ossewabrandwag as he calls them white terrorists. Whether we agree with that or not is besides the point. But he's got a book on Ossewabrandwag, and he's also got a book on the leader of the Ossewabrandwag, Hans van Rensburg, which is very good. And then also Roby Leibrand, which was another South African that had received training in Germany and infiltrated back into South Africa. So I think he's done some interesting stuff. On the academic front, we recently have a lady in South Africa, Evert Kleynhans, no relative, but she done work on Radio Zeesen, which was a German shortwave radio station that broadcasted propaganda across the world during the Second World War, and which the intelligence organizations also used as an intermediary to pass along coded messages. So she's done some excellent work there. The thesis was published with Northwest University last year. And then, so here and there are people working sort of in the field. And I think Ian van der Waag has also done some work recently on the South Africans that served with the British Free Corps. So every year there's a little bit more and more happening out there, but it's a field that's wide open. So we have a prospective master student who's probably going to work on the Tromke network, which was the German intelligence organization working in Maputo in Mozambique during the war. But we've only scratched the surface. There's really, really, really so much to still research and write about.
Evert, very good sources over there. And now a little bit unrelated and just for the hell of it, top of your head, who are 2 or 3 significant South African commanders who left their footprint on our history or on the history of the world?
That's an interesting one. It's like you want to start a bar fight. I think for me, no specific order. I think he was Major General when he passed away, Dan Pienaar, who was the commander of the 1st Brigade in East Africa in the Second World War, and he later on became the officer commanding of the 1st South African Division. He was, by 1942, by the time he passed away, or I think it was either late 42 or early 1943, he was probably the top South African general of the war, and it would have been interesting to see where his career would have gone afterwards. But I think he was really good. He was a very, very, very good general. Then I do also probably put the likes of the General Roland de Vries of the South African Defence Force up there that fought in Angola in the Second World War. I think from a mobility combined arms perspective, I think he's also up there. And then my other one would be also Second World War Major General Everett Poole, the commander of the 6th South African Armored Division. I think he commanded probably one of the most technologically advanced divisions of its time in South African military history. And he became a victim of the post-Second World War period when the National Party took over in 1948. He was basically shunted from the Defence Force as the next in line to become the chief of the Defence Force. He was basically relegated to a diplomatic position. So I think, that's sort of the ones I would put up there. But I think there are many, many good generals out there, and everybody will, of course, have their own top 3.
Now, very good choice. Very good choice. We'll add them in the show notes for those that want to know.
Thanks.
I mean, come on, it's not going to be like, it's these or nothing, but I think those are very good choices. Roland de Vries also, having written a few books, I think we can add a link there. I think it's Mobile Warfare or Mobile Oorlogvoering. Very interesting stuff. But a big thank you from us for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
It's been great having you. And then, Max, last words to you.
Same for me, Evert. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I would love to unpack a bit more of this intelligence and counterintelligence stories from South Africa, and I hope we get an opportunity to do that once more. But thank you so much for coming, and we will see you all next week. Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.